Today, I'm going to explain a war drama movie called Stoploss. Spoilers ahead. Watch out and take care. The movie opens in 2001 as the US-led invasion of Iraq is at its peak. A group of American soldiers under the command of squadron leader Brandon King are counting down the days till they can go back home. Private First Class Tommy Burgess captures footage of life in the barracks where the young soldiers train, sing, and long for their families. One day, the squad is out in the streets, guarding a checkpoint that goes out of Tikrit. They are making sure that the vehicles headed in and out are not carrying any kind of weapons. Everything seems to be routine, until they hear 3 loud shots in the distance. Staff Sergeant Brandon King tells his men to stay alert, just as a car carrying 3 women and 2 children approaches the checkpoint. However, seconds later, a white taxi barrels towards the spot at great speed, and all hell breaks loose. The insurgents in the vehicle open fire before making a quick U-turn. Brandon orders his men to give chase, and the squad follows in 2 Humvees. Since there are too many civilians on the streets, the Americans cannot risk open gun battle. They keep on chasing their target vehicle, which soon drives into a small alleyway. The insurgents then quickly disembark and spread throughout the neighboring homes, but the Humvees, being bigger, are forced to stop at the mouth of the alleyway. In America, bigger is better, but not here. The American soldiers then get off their vehicles, form 2 flanks on either side of the street, and begin to scan the whole area. 2 privates also man the 50 caliber machine guns that are mounted on top of the 2 Humvees. Meanwhile, Brandon tells his men to check the nearby homes. As they slowly inch towards the spot where the white taxi is parked, they are now in the narrowest part of the alleyway, surrounded by tall residential buildings on both sides. At this critical moment, the insurgents, who were hiding on top of these buildings, open fire. This finally makes the Americans realize that the whole chase was just a trap to lure them here. They are now pinned down on the street level with Iraqi militants firing at them from 3 sides. Brandon tells his men that they are being ambushed and orders them to fall back. However, Sergeant Steve Shriver sees 2 enemy soldiers on the other side of the street and rushes to guard the spot. This is when things go from bad to worse, as an RPG hits one of the Humvees, obliterating the 2 soldiers inside. The Americans then try to mask their position by throwing smoke grenades and calling for backup. Seconds later, another RPG is fired towards an Iraqi vehicle parked nearby. Tommy is about to be hit, but a fellow soldier named Rico Rodriguez selflessly dives onto him. The latter takes the brunt of the explosion and sustains severe injuries. Moments later, squad member Paul Preacher Colson is shot right through the neck. He drops dead onto the lap of Tommy, who is still trying to gather his senses after the RPG explosion. That's the quickest a character has died after being introduced in mystery history. As the chaos unfolds, Brandon rushes into a nearby house to aid Steve, who has gone in all alone. He finds him injured and is forced to use 2 grenades as he goes in. Brandon does manage to save his comrade, but also discovers that his actions resulted in the deaths of several civilians. He grapples with the harsh realities of war as the ambush concludes with the loss of 3 soldiers. A few weeks later, the surviving members of the squad return to their hometown of Brazos, Texas. They are met with a warm welcome from the community, with people lining the streets to greet them. A huge carnival has been arranged in their honor, headed by the U.S. Senator Orton Worrell. The soldiers are decorated with bronze stars and purple hearts in a solemn ceremony. Despite the outpouring of support, Brandon finds himself overwhelmed by the crowd and is hesitant to deliver a speech. Steve recognizes his friend's apprehension and steps in to speak a few rousing sentences. After the ceremony, the senator pulls Brandon aside and has a one-to-one conversation. The senator says he's proud of what the soldiers have done for the country and offers help in any way possible. He also announces that they are bringing the injured Private Rodriguez to a hospital in the US. Brandon thanks him and says he'll call if he needs any kind of help. That night, the returning soldiers attend a party at a local bar and have drinks with their family. Steve gets too drunk to dance with his fiancée Michelle, so Brandon steps in and dances with her instead. Steve, meanwhile, starts talking about what happened in the war, making people around him uncomfortable. After the rowdy night of drinking and partying, everyone goes back to their own homes. Brandon is busy unpacking his stuff when suddenly he receives a call from Michelle. She sounds extremely worried and asks him to come over ASAP. When Brandon arrives at her home, he finds a nearly naked Steve digging a hole in the front yard. He attempts to talk to his friend, but Steve is too wasted to make any sense. Brandon then enters the house, only to see that the whole place is a mess. He also notices a bruise on Michelle's cheek and realizes that her fiancé hit her. Outside, Steve has finished digging his hole and starts sleeping in it while holding a gun. It is obvious that he thinks they are still in the middle of a war zone. Worried for his friend, Brandon decides to sleep on the front porch to make sure everything remains calm for the night. His sleep, however, is interrupted when Tommy drives his car into a pole right in front of the house. He too is extremely drunk drunk and reveals that his wife kicked him out of the house. The following day, Brandon takes all the boys to his ranch, a small forest cabin right outside of town. They spend their time drinking and watching Tommy shoot his wedding gifts. Meanwhile, a hungover Steve is still sleeping in the trunk when he hears the sound of the gunshots. He is startled awake and has no idea where he currently is. However, he stumbles forward and puts his head into a bucket of ice water to regain his composure. The next day, Brandon, Tommy, and Steve report to their military base to hand over their gears, but Brandon is instead ordered back to active duty in Iraq. He is left baffled and goes to talk to the head of his chain of command, Lieutenant Colonel Boot Miller. Brandon expresses his frustration over the unexpected order and says he doesn't want to go back to the war zone, but the Lieutenant Colonel explains that the president has issued a stop-loss order. It is a controversial policy, which forces soldiers who have fulfilled their required tours of duty to return to war. This sends Brandon into a fit of rage and he chastises the policy as well as the president, but the Lieutenant Colonel accuses him of disobeying orders and sends him to military prison, citing that he is a flight risk. However, on the way to the nearest military camp, Brandon fights the two escorting soldiers and escapes. He even steals a military jeep and drives away from the base. The squadron leader then calls his best mate Steve and reveals that he is going AWOL after being stop-lossed back to Iraq. Steve is shocked by the revelation, but promises to figure things out and cover for him. That night, Brandon sneaks into his home and discusses the matter with his family. He plans to head to Washington, D.C., hoping that Senator Worrell will help him. His father is concerned about violating the chain of command and going behind the Lieutenant Colonel's back. However, Brandon insists on doing so, and his parents are forced to accept this decision. Michelle, who had come over to the King household to return Tupperware, offers to drive him to D.C. She knows that if Brandon is being sent back, then her fiancé will also be redeployed. By going to D.C., she will get a chance to make a case for Steve as well. Following this, the duo hits the road and soon books a motel for the night. Michelle then goes in to freshen up while Brandon sits by the pool. Everything seems to be calm until suddenly he sees a soldier drowning in the water. He jumps in to rescue his comrade, only to realize that he was hallucinating the whole event. It is obvious that Brandon is beginning to show the first signs of PTSD. Sometime later, Steve calls Brandon and says that he is currently in a military prison trying to bail Tommy out of a DUI situation. Steve points out that as the squad leader, Brandon needs to handle the situation, but the latter says he's on his way to DC to see Senator Worrell. Early the next morning, Brandon and Michelle visit the family of Paul Preacher Colson, one of the soldiers killed in the alley ambush. Brandon recounts the events, explaining how they came under attack at a checkpoint and pursued the attackers into an alley. He admits to leading his men into the ambush, while Preacher was covering their flank. Brandon can barely fight back tears as he asks for forgiveness from Preacher's family. Later, when the duo heads back to the road, they discover that their car's window has been broken. Brandon then tells Michelle to wait for him while he goes to confront the people responsible for this. He soon tracks them down into an alley and engages in a physical fight with them. One of the thugs pulls out a gun, but the soldier easily manages to disarm him. By this point, Brandon is beginning to hallucinate, feeling like he is back in Iraq. He forces the perpetrators to their knees and prepares to shoot them. Things are about to take a dark twist when suddenly Michelle intervenes. She talks some sense into Brandon and drags him back to the car. After the incident, the duo gets a hotel room where she cleans his wounds. Later that night, Brandon meets another AWOL soldier who's been running away for the past 14 months. He reveals the contact number of a lawyer to help arrange forged discharge documents. With these documents, Brandon could establish a new identity in Canada. The following morning, Steve tracks down his friend and arrives at the hotel. He informs Brandon that if he returns to the base within 14 hours, all charges will be dropped. But Brandon rejects the offer and instead asks why Steve is in his uniform. It turns out that Steve has accepted the military's offer to get into a sniper school. Realizing that her fiancé is headed back to Iraq, an enraged Michelle asks what will happen to their relationship. She refuses to hear any excuses and ends up pushing Steve out of the room. Brandon then follows him outside, and the duo has a heart-to-heart conversation. Steve reveals about Tommy's struggles and urges Brandon to return to duty with him, but the latter once again refuses, citing that he cannot watch innocent people being maimed to death. Shortly afterwards, Brandon calls Worrell's office, but is told that the senator is not interested in seeing him. With their options slimming down by the day, Brandon and Michelle visit Rico Rodriguez, a soldier who heroically saved Tommy from an RPG. Rico has sustained severe injuries, including blindness, the loss of his right limbs, and facial burns, but he still expresses gratitude for being out of Iraq just in time. Brandon then reveals that they are sending him back to the front line in Iraq. Did they really have to tell him that? After the visit, Brandon opens up to Michelle, expressing his initial motivations for joining the military. His disillusionment was soon shattered as he realizes the true nature of the war. He describes the chaos and uncertainty of the battlefield, where everyone seemed to be armed and no one could be trusted. Brandon shares his guilt and trauma over witnessing the deaths of friends and the toll it took on his mentality. He also tells her of how he accidentally killed innocent Iraqi civilians, including a kid. That night, Brandon calls the lawyer and says he needs forged documents to leave for Canada. The lawyer refuses to discuss the details over the phone and instructs him to meet with $1,000. Thus, Michelle sells her car, and they head to New York with the cash in hand. They soon meet up with the lawyer, who tells Brandon that there is no going back after he crosses into Canada. He then gives him a new ID and a phone number of an agent who will pick him up on the other side. That night, Brandon calls his mom to tell her about his decision, but receives shocking news in return. His dear friend and junior, Tommy, was found dead on the ranch last night. He had been suffering from acute PTSD and ended his life by putting a bullet through his head. The very next day, Brandon returns to Texas and pays a visit to Tommy's grave after everyone has left. Steve, who is nearby, notices this and confronts his best friend. Their conversation quickly escalates into an argument, and then into a full-blown fight. Steve accuses him of leaving their squad without a leader, but Brandon fires back, saying they will all suffer and die in a pointless war. The duo wrestles around in the mud for a while and eventually regains their composure. Finally, Brandon opens up, saying that he feels responsible for leading their group into that alleyway and killing so many of their fellow soldiers. Steve points out that he would have died without Brandon's leadership, but the latter has had enough. He then leaves the graveyard, leaving his best friend to cry in frustration. Following this, Brandon visits his house to meet his parents and bid them farewell. He packs his bag, after which his mother and Michelle drive him to the Canadian border. Once there, Brandon takes a moment for himself and realizes that he is about to leave behind everything he has ever known. He also knows that even if he crosses the border, the ghosts of the war will never leave him. There is no escape, only a choice between two torturous paths. Eventually, Brandon changes his mind and decides to stay back in the United States. As the movie comes to an end, we are shown a busload of new and old recruits heading to the military base in Texas. Brandon, Steve, and Lieutenant Colonel Boot are also on the bus, going for yet another tour of Iraq.